All right, welcome everybody. What is this, session 7, I think? Not sure, I lost count. Didn't record last week's, I forgot. Well, we got part of the recording, I just haven't uploaded to my YouTube channel. Need to get on that. Anyways, we are continuing with chapter 2. Last time we finished something and limit. We made it all the way to the beginning of the finite. Let me see. Should I make a... Does anybody feel that they need a quick repass over that? So
I'd appreciate it.
All right, well, we can do that. All right, so just to go over things again, not going to go, but... So we began this whole thing with being and nothing. As far as, hopefully everybody should have gotten the point that this is a cognitive move concerning just what we're actually capable of thinking in pure immediacy or indeterminacy. To think immediately, we fail to think. That very failure to think is itself a thought. Therefore, nothing. The failure to think is nothing, but then the recognition that we have thought nothing or we fail to think is itself the being of thought. So being and nothing go back and forth. From that, we have that process of the transitions, or rather the vanishings, as Hegel calls it, of being and nothing towards each other. These themselves turn into the moments of becoming, of ceasing to be and coming to be. Oh, they have the same initials, damn it. You can tell. One of them is being to nothing. The other is nothing to being. These then shift not towards each other, but rather within themselves. Hegel calls it self-sublation. I should change the color on that. Hegel says being and nothing self-sublate and coming to be and ceasing to be. And in the self-sublation, since there is no temporality, what is and becomes immediately goes back to what it was again. If coming to be was originally nothing, as soon as it's being, it's back to nothing. So it ends up looking as just nothing, and then the other one ends up looking just the same as being. Being, insofar as it becomes nothing, immediately is right back to being. And so this stabilization is the becoming of becoming, which then ends up looking to us as nothing other than being and nothing side by side. This side-by-sidedness is existence. Existence is merely this unity, this immediate unity of being and nothing, not transitioning into each other, but stabilized within themselves. Insofar as anything exists, we know that it's going to be, well, insofar as anything is, it's going to exist. And insofar as anything is not, it's going to exist. The pair comes together. So existence has that emphasis on being, but it's not really reduced to the immediacy of being. It is immediate, but the tie to being is only a superficial one. Determinacy itself is the being, which then intakes nothing. One could say it like that, or you have the unity. Either way, doesn't matter. That's determinacy as such. Determinacy as such, in general, is quality. determinacy is going to be a more general way of talking about quality, because determinacy can also be, or at least we use determinacy in a way that we can talk about quantity as well. So here there is no movement towards anything. Determinacy is quality, just a different emphasis in use. Quality that is reality. Quality that is not is negation. Or rather, this is the way I tend to like to portray this. And the way you can see this is either in the sense of, the unity. The unity of being and nothing is reality, that immediacy of the totality, and the non-being of that unity is negation. Negation is, one can say, if you look at a reality is determinate being. This is literally, this is the old translation that was used by Miller. He called it determinate being. I apologize for my terrible handwriting. But it's legible enough. So if this is determinate being, and determinacy is just that unity of being and non-being itself in a mode of being, it also reflects into a mode of nothing. So if reality is determinate being, this is negation is determinate non-being, or determinate nothing. I think that makes much intuitive sense. Then reality and negation again come into relationship. These, as a totality in immediacy, are something. Something, insofar we can play this out. So if something is, then it exists. If it exists, then it has a big, fat mirror nothing next to it. That's not the way I usually like to explain it, though. What I like to say is, if something is the unity of reality and negation, then you can also think of something to that extent. Also, then otherness is the non-unity or the non-being of that same relationship, the distinction of it. Insofar as this is not this, that's what otherness is. From that, the unity of something in otherness brought us into the being for other, which is a mode of otherness. This would be something, this would be something. Insofar as this is by not being this, it is a being for it is, so it is therefore being for other. The inverse ends up coming up with being in itself, that insofar as something is in itself, or insofar as something is not for other, it is in itself. The being for other of being for other is itself being in itself. From that, we have a further movement towards determination, in which being for other brought into something, into its in itself, is what determination as such is. One could say that the two circles is a mutual being for other, that brought into itself is determination, then that in itself is within a larger something. Then determination also is, which means it exists, which means it has an opposite next to it, which you could say there's a transition to the opposite of constitution, or you can then take this totality and just say, well, if determination is, it's faced by another determination, but this is an external relationship of, a negation, but that means something else, that means constitution. Then that dialectic leads us to limits, that the unity of determinacy and of constitution, itself in a negative mode, but also a positive mode. Therefore, the limit is a proper sublative moment that is equally negative and positive in emphasis. That insofar as things are unified and distinguished within the determination and constitution, they are limited. Then limit is the opposite of something, Hegel says. It's the true other. But the other, we already know, is internal to something. So the limit is in something. And this is the standpoint in which we now are, in which we have something limited. So a finite thing is something within and through its limit. Insofar as something is, it is distinguished through its limit. You don't even have to make much of anything else. This line, the line of the circle, is itself the limit. If there wasn't that line to limit the determination from the constitution, you simply would have nothing at all. You get rid of the limit, you get rid of the notion of an in itself, therefore you get our notion of an outside or a being for other, and we arrive right back to where we were in the very beginning of the science of logic, and we know where that leads us. So, you cannot continue on without taking into account this internal reality of limits. All right, clear enough? Refresh your minds. Yes, no?
Yeah, no, that was very good. Thanks.
All right. So we'll get on to the text. I hope that we might make it to the end of chapter 2. I doubt it, though. I didn't... for some reason, I thought that the section on finitude was much shorter than it ends up being. But either way, we will see. So, finitude. See finitude. It's on the PDF, that's page 101. Existence is determinate. Something has a quality, and in this quality it is not only determined but delimited. Its quality is its limit, and affected by it, something remains affirmative, quiescent existence, but so developed that the opposition of its existence and of the negation as the limit immanent to this existence is the very in itselfness of the something, and this is thus only becoming in it. This negation constitutes the finitude of the something. When we say of things that they are finite, we understand by this that they not only have a determinateness, that their quality is not only reality and existent determination, that they are not merely limited and as such still have existence outside their limit, but rather that non-being constitutes their nature, their being. Finite things are, but in their reference to themselves, refer to themselves negatively. In this very self-reference, they propel themselves, beyond their being. They are, but the truth of this being is, as in Latin, their finis, their end. The finite does not just alter as the something in general does, but perishes. And its perishing is not just a mere possibility as if it might be without perishing. Rather, the being as such of finite things is to have the germ of this transgression in their in itselfness. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death. Famous poetic line right there. And this is something that people don't think about, and it is interesting when Hegel points it out, because it's, to me, it seems obviously true once it's pointed out, that a finite thing is something that is in the mode of nothing. The very way in which we mean finitude is as a mode of nothingness rather than a mode of positive being. A finite thing is precisely something that essentially is not. It has its limits. Not only does it have limits, but it's bound by that limit and destroyed when it transgresses that limit. But because of what we know about something and limit, something itself is a limit of limit, therefore transgresses limits, and therefore comes to its own end. Insofar as you go beyond the limit and you step away from it, the limit dissolves and you're left with indeterminate existence yet again. Another thing with the finite is that the finite always ends up positing itself as a vanishing mediator, in which, if you have numbers, for example, you have 0, 0 posits 1, posits 2, posits 3, if the very meaning of numbers is in these quantities, the quantities themselves bring into the addition of the very notion, if one could call them numbers notions, the next number. So, you just keep going on infinitely. There's no reason to stay, there's no reason to stop. And if, insofar as you stay, you erase the boundaries of the limit, you are in the in itself, and it becomes indeterminate, nothing or existent again. So the meaning of finitude is precisely within the bounds of its limits. Outside of that limit, it is not. Inside of that limit, it also is not. And the limit itself is a non-being as much as it is a being. So alpha, the immediacy of finitude. The thought of the finitude of things brings this mournful note with it, because finitude is a qualitative negation driven to the extreme, and in the simplicity of such a determination, there is no longer left to things an affirmative being distinct from their determination as things destined to ruin. Because of this qualitative simplicity of negation that has returned to the abstract opposition of nothing and perishing to being, finitude is the most obstinate of the categories of the understanding. Negation in general, constitution, limit, are compatible with their other, with existence. Even the abstract nothing by itself is given up as an abstraction. But finitude is negation fixed in itself, and as such stands in stark contrast to its affirmative. The finite thus does indeed let itself be submitted to flux. This is precisely what it is, that it should come to an end, and this end is its only determination. Its refusal is rather to let itself be brought affirmatively to its affirmative, the infinite, to be associated with it. It is therefore inseparably posited with its nothing, and thereby cut off from any reconciliation with its other, the affirmative. The determination of finite things does not go past their end. The understanding persists in this sorrow of finitude, for it makes non-being the determination of things, and at the same time this non-being imperishable and absolute. Contradiction right there. Their transitoriness would only pass away in their other, in the affirmative. Their finitude would then be severed from them, but this finitude is their unalterable quality, that is, their quality which does not pass over into their other, that is, not into the affirmative, and so finitude is eternal. All right, that's pretty good. So one of the ways in which you could think about finitude is, let me switch to the visuals. So it should be apparent, for example, that finitude, if you want to put in a past category, is a form of being for other. Things are finite insofar as they are being, for other. Insofar as they are being towards another, they're not self-contained. A finite thing is not a self-contained thing. You go from one finite to another finite ad infinitum. There is no end to it. There is no end to the chain of determination. It is a form of otherness, and therefore, it's a form of concrete nothingness, form of concrete negativity. Let me just reread this more slowly. So, the thought of the finitude of things, it brings this mournful note with it because finitude is qualitative negation driven to the extreme, and in the simplicity of such a determination, there is no longer left to things an affirmative being distinct from the determination as things destined to ruin. Because of this qualitative simplicity of negation that has returned to the abstract opposition of nothing and perishing to being, finitude is the most obstinate of the categories of the understanding. Negation, in general, constitutional limit are compatible with their other, with existence. Even the abstract nothing by itself is given up as an abstraction. But finitude is negation fixed in itself, and as such stands in contrast to its affirmative. So here what he's talking about, remember, negation is the non-being or mutual non-being of objects, we could call them here. Finitude is contradictory in the sense that also it's this, it's negation in a positive mode, taken as itself being, that the being of the finite is its negative being, its non-being. Specifically, so remember, determination is that which is in the quality, which is in a thing. The determination of the finite is its negative, it is negation. You could also say it's being for other. It is its limit. The finite thus does indeed let itself be submitted to flux. This is precisely what it is, that it should come to an end, and this end is its only determination. Its refusal is rather to let itself be brought affirmatively to its affirmative, the infinite, to be associated with it. It is therefore inseparably posited with its nothing, and thereby cut off from any reconciliation with its other, the affirmative. The determination of finite things does not go past their end. So to give you a view of this, what he's talking about there, about that the finite does not let itself as finite come to an end. So the finite posits that it's one thing after another, And so each of these comes to an end. But this process of vanishing from one finite moment to another is itself endless. So the finite category as finite does not end, and therefore it does not become infinite. Here we're not talking about the infinite yet, but Hegel will talk about it very quickly. And he also goes over this endless repetition. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Thereby cut off from the determination of the finite things does not go past their end. The understanding persists in this sorrow of finitude, for it makes non-being the determination of things, and at the same time, this non-being imperishable and absolute. So, the finite somehow is infinitized. That which ends is made an endless cycle of the end. Their transitoriness would only be pass away in their other. In the affirmative, their finitude would then be severed from them. But this finitude is their unalterable quality. That is their quality which does not pass over into their other. That is, not into the affirmative. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you reading? Are you reading right now?
Yeah.
We can't see the text.
Oh.
Or at least I can.
There we go.
Yeah, it's not showing up. Okay, there.
I forgot to change it. To do an multiple quality, that is the quality which does not pass over into their other, that is not into the affirmative, and so finitude is eternal. So, I mean, that's an obvious contradiction already. This is a very important consideration, but that the finite is absolute is certainly not a standpoint that any philosophy or outlook or understanding would want to endorse. The opposite is rather expressly present in the assertion of finitude. The finite is the restricted, the perishable. The finite is only the finite, not the imperishable. All this is immediately part and parcel of its determination and expression, but all depends on whether, in one's view of finitude, its being is insisted on, and these transitoriness thus persist, or whether the transitoriness and the perishing perish. The fact that this perishing of the perishing does not happen on precisely the view that would make the perishing the final end of the finite. Oh wait, I read that oddly. The fact is that this perishing of the perishing does not happen on precisely the view that would make the perishing the final end of the finite. The official claim is that the finite is incompatible with the infinite and cannot be united with it, that the finite is absolutely opposed to the infinite. Being, absolute being, is ascribed to the infinite. The finite remains held fast over against it as its negative, incapable of union with the infinite. It remains absolute on its own side. From the affirmative, from the infinite, it would receive affirmation and thus it would perish. But a union with the infinite is precisely what is declared impossible. If the finite were not to persist over against the infinite, but were to perish, its perishing, as just said, would then be the last of it, not its affirmative, which would be only a perishing of the perishing. However, if it is not to perish into the affirmative, but its end is rather to be grasped as a nothing, then we are back at that first abstract nothing that itself has long since passed away. Alright, so general gist of this was clearly that there's a contradiction in the way that people talk about the finite, and it's in the very way that we talk about the finite. The finite is supposed to be that which has an end, and then we obviously make it, well, not only does it have an end, but its being is a non-being, particularly a movement to transitoriness. He talks about here that the movement of something in limits. The finite, funny enough, has a form of becoming. This perishing of the perishing that Hegel mentions should remind you of the end of chapter 1, of the vanishing of vanishing, becoming of becoming. And that the purpose and the function of a vanishing is that it does not appear. The vanishing vanishes immediately, because that's what the nature of vanishing is. Likewise, the finite, in being finite, should immediately undo itself. Insofar as it is not, and we're done with it. We transcend it. To ascribe a positive form to finitude, of course, is logically valid, but to stick with it in that positive form without taking the affirmation of its negative form is a mistake. So, the finite is, but its being is precisely that movement of its non-being. It's perishing. It's something going past its limits and dissolving. So continuing, with this nothing, however, which is supposed to be only nothing, but to which a reflective existence is nevertheless granted in thought, in representation, or in speech, the same contradiction occurs as we have just indicated in connection with the finite, except that in the nothing it just occurs, but in the finite it is instead expressed. In the one case, the contradiction appears as subjective. In the other, the finite is said to stand in perpetual opposition to the infinite, in itself to be null, and to be as null in itself. This is not to be brought to consciousness. The development of the finite will show that expressly as this contradiction, it collapses internally, but that in this collapse, it actually resolves the contradiction. It will show that the finite is not just perishable, in that it perishes, but that the perishing, the nothing, is rather not the last of it, that the perishing rather perishes. So just something to highlight over there. So the finite is just this movement of one finite entity into another finite entity endlessly. And then the infinite is this giant, indeterminate beyond. Outside it. This is like people who talk about, to put it in a metaphysical sense, absolute being. This whole area outside it would be absolute being. It is unbounded, not even bounded by the boundedness of the bound, which is the finite. And of course, this is a contradiction, because then the finite is made absolute. It does not dissolve into the infinite, and the infinite is made finite because it's opposed to the finite. It is brought upon the level of opposition with it. That's contradictory on multiple levels, and we're going to go into that now. So he's restricting the ought. So this contradiction is indeed abstractly present by the very fact that the something is finite, or that the finite is. But something or being is no longer posited abstractly, but reflected into itself and developed as being in itself that has determination and constitution in it, or more determinedly still, in such a way that it has a limit within it. And this limit as constituting what is immanent to the something and the quality of its being in itself is finitude. It is to be seen what moments are contained in this concept of the finite something. So the finite is something limited, and the limit we know is in the something. It's not external to it, it's not something bounding it from the outside, it's the internal bound within itself. Determination and constitution arose as sides for external reflection, but determination already contained otherness as belonging to the in itself of something. On the one side, the externality of otherness is within the something's own inwardness. On the other side, it remains as otherness distinguished from it. It is still externality as such, but in the something. But further, since otherness is determined as limit, itself as negation of the negation, the otherness immanent to the something is posited as the connection of the two sides, and the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong, is its reference turned back upon itself, the reference to it of its implicitly existing determination that in it negates its immanent limit. The self-identical in itself thus refers itself to itself as to its own non-being, but as negation of the negation, as negating that which at the same time retains existence in it, for it is the quality of its in itselfness. Something's own limit, thus posited by its negative, which is at the same time essential, is not only limit as such, but restriction. But restriction is not alone in being posited as negative. The negation cuts two ways, for that which it posits is negated as negated is limit, and limit is in general what is common to something and other, and is also the determinateness of the in itself or determination as such. This in itself, consequently, as negative reference to its limit, which is also distinguished from it, as negative reference to itself as restriction, is the ought. And okay, that was very dense. Let's go through this, try to diagram this. Alright, it says, determination and constitution arose as sides for external reflection, but determination already contained otherness as belonging to the in itself of something. On the one side, the externality of otherness is within the something's own inwardness. So, the being for other is within the being itself. That's what determination is. On the other side, it remains as otherness distinguished from it. So, this is the something which has determination within it, and the other remains as other outside. It is still externality as such, but in the something, right? Because the something is the other of the other has otherness within it. But further, since otherness is determined as limit, itself as negation of the negation, the otherness immanent to the something is posited as the connection of the two sides and the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong, is its reference turned back upon itself, the reference to it of its implicitly existing determination that in it negates its immanent limit. So, let me see. So, let's take these. Alright, give me a sec. Dígame. Sí, ahorita sí.
Cuando te desocupes, ¿me vienes para acá, no?
Okay.
No es importante, pero...
Okay. Alright, sorry about that. Where was I? Alright, so again, this bounding line is limit. This totality is the something. That which is divided by the limit is the other and the something. But the something subsumes this division. The limit both goes, well, here I diagrammed that a bit wrong. The something is this totality that bounds it. So this is the other. The other is in the something. The limit distinguishes the something and the other. But likewise, this other is itself a something. And so what we have in this relationship, one could say, is something and something, self-reference right there, as you can tell. The limit, obviously, this being the limit. The limit not only limits something, but the somethings also are limits to the limit. The something limits the limit. Another self-reference. So he says, but further, since otherness is determined as limit, itself as negation of the negation, the otherness immanent to the something is posited as the connection of the two sides. And the unity of the something with itself is its reference turned back upon itself, the reference to it of its implicitly existing determination that in it negates its immanent limit. So that, the something is the self-reference of the other. The limit is also the self-reference of the something. And the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong, is its reference turned back upon itself. Insofar as something is something, it is limited. The reference to it of its implicitly existing determination that in it negates its immanent limit. So something is within the limit. But what is within something is determination. So, this side, insofar as it is something, it is also determination. So now we're going to, Hegel's going to shift to talking about the relationship of determination to the limit, rather than something to the limit, but it's basically talking about the same thing. So he says, the self-identical in itself thus refers itself to itself as to its own non-being, but as negation of the negation, as negation negating that which at the same time retains existence in it, for it is the quality of its in itselfness. Something's own limit, thus posited by it as a negative, which is at the same time essential, is not only limit as such, but restriction. So insofar as something is that which again bounds its own limit, the line being the limit, or rather, let's put it this way. So the limit is now itself limited, limit of limit. The way to see it's hard to picture this because it's very simple and at the same time its meaning is complex. So this is what Hegel calls restriction. Let me reread that. So okay, it says the self-identical in itself thus refers itself to itself as to its own non-being, but as negation of negation, as negating that which at the same time retains existence in it, for it is the quality of its in itselfness. Something's own limit, thus posited by it as a negative, which is at the same time essential, is not only limit as such, but restriction. So insofar as this, the something, limits the limit, or rather is limited by the limit, you could say that this, the line inside, is the something, then this, the white space, would be its limit. Insofar as the something takes this position of the limit bound by a limit, it is restriction. I don't know. Does that make sense, or does that confuse things? Don't know if the diagrams are being helpful or not. Because there's a way in which, linguistically, this works perfectly fine, and then you try to show it diagrammatically, and it's so simple that it becomes complex in an odd way. Because the way to grasp this is also just simply that insofar as something is not its limit, but is limited by its limit, it is restricted. So, a simpler way to put it would probably be like this, right? It's just like this is something. So finitude is something and limit. And this totality is finitude. If you remember, I didn't go into detail with the recap, but if you remember that you've been here before for the other sessions, you remember that we had moments where we run things through their opposites. So for example, determination was being for other, which is in being in itself. And being in itself was, of course, this kind of relationship in which we had like existence, for example, with something in which the relationship is doubled. The structure is is doubled. So in that way, what is happening with restriction is we're running, so we had the opposition of something and limit. So rather than having them as just merely side-by-side dialectical opposites, we're now running something within the limit. So something within its limit is restricted. It's about as simple as I could put that. Does that make sense?
I must say I really appreciate the chart.
All right. So, just as something is within the limit, you can kind of guess what's coming with the other form, in which, like, we're going to run it the opposite way. So he says, but restriction is not alone in being posited as negative. The negation cuts two ways. For that which it posits is negated, as negated is limit. And limit is in general what is common to something and other, and is also the determinateness of the in itself of determination as such. This in itself consequently as negative reference to its limit, which is also distinguished from it, as negative reference to itself as restriction, is the ought. Negative reference is always such a key thing. So insofar as something is within its limit or is restricted, and insofar as something is beyond its limit or outside of its limit, or rather, properly speaking, limits its limit, it is the ought. So, if you have this, the limit, this, the something, or the determination, this, limiting this is what the ought is. The ought is that which limits the limit. So rather than being limited by the limit, it limits the limit. And notice the peculiarity that restriction and the ought are both limits of limits, but in an obverse, inverted sense. Now, I think that explanation Hegel gave is awful. I don't. It's too obtuse. It's showing you how the prior determinations can always be played into whatever you're doing, and you can deepen the meaning to a ridiculous degree. But really, you only need to go this far. We have something, and we have it with its limit. This unity is the finite. The finite which is, because the finite already is a contradiction. The is always, if it is, it exists. Therefore, the finite will involve a motive too, but let's not get to that. So the finite which takes into account the non-being, yet unlike anything else before that, unlike everything else, now non-being is taking itself as a positive. That is what the restriction is. So the being of non-being, we've had that before, but we haven't had it with an emphasis in which the non-being is specifically the being. We've had the non-being in which, the distinction is, or the non-being is what is emphasized in the non-being. But here, the being is emphasized in the non-being. It's a contradictory thing. It's something that is only in its limit. The obverse, then, of course, is insofar as the self-reference is made, in which through its non-being, this something limits the limit. Insofar it is not the limit, insofar as it limits the limit, as it is the other of the other, it is the ought. Another way to put it is literally in the simple verbal linguistic form that insofar as restriction is restricted, or let's just put it, so this is restriction, it is, therefore it exists. It's in relationship then to its other. What is its other? Restriction. Restriction is restricted. What is the meaning of this? Well, what is it that restricts restriction? In this case, it's not restriction. There is a different meaning we have for that. What restricts restriction is the ought. So this self-restriction, this self-reference is what the ought is. That insofar as the finite is, it is restricted, but if it is restricted, it is restricted. What is restricting it? The ought. Does that make sense?
Could you go through that, like?
It can get confusing because like even just that paragraph you saw in the text, it's very self-referential. And it is so by design. You can't not do it that way. So, insofar as something is limited, right? We have the unity of something and its limit. Insofar as we have something which is limited, it is finite. The immediacy of this, so from the finite to restriction of the ought, we're not doing like a sublative move. Just like how determinacy was a different name for quality, the finite immediately is a different name for restriction. Or rather, restriction is a different name for the finite, which is something limited. But if something is limited, if it is restricted, if something is restricted, it exists, because in order to be, this limit, that line, the circle's line is the limit. This is the something, you could say. The something is within the line. It's being restricted. What is causing the restriction? That the meaning of that is that this whole outsidedness is the ought. This restricts the restriction. You see what I mean? Like this limit line is mutually restricting. It restricts both the inside, but it also restricts the outside. And that's a self-reference. Restriction of restriction ought. Make sense?
I got a better idea of it.
All right, and then well, he's gonna go into it because obviously then, insofar as the restriction is, it is restricted. Therefore, what restricts the restriction is the ought, just like the other of the other was a something. But the ought, because it is the ought of a restriction, and it itself is a non-being, because the ought is the non-being of the restriction, but what is the restriction. Therefore, the ought itself was also restricted because its opposite determinate in relation to the restriction. So then we fall back from restriction to the ought, back to restriction, and it's a circle. That's how we get that dialectic. Insofar as the finite is, insofar as something is limited, it is restricted. If it is restricted, what restricts the restriction, we understand by that the ought. Insofar as the ought is that which is restricting the restriction itself restricts it, therefore it is restricted, therefore we fall right back into the restriction. Make sense?
this entire cycle comes from the finite.
Yeah, this is all the determinacy of the finite. Like, this is all just like the finite is restriction immediately. Then we have the notion of the ought. Then the ought, because it is in relationship to the restricted, itself is restricted by the restriction. Therefore, it's restriction again.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I think I got it.
So that's where that circuit is happening. And I mean, like I've said many times, this feels like word games, because in a way it is. It's a meaning game. It's a self-referential meaning game. It's just like, what does this actually like operationally mean if we actually play the meaning out? Because if the restriction didn't have something else restricting it, it wouldn't be restricted. If there was nothing beyond the limits, then the limit wouldn't be a limit. The something wouldn't be restricted, it wouldn't be finite. But since it's finite, it posits something else that restricts it. But that something else that restricts it is not immediately seen as itself restricted. Rather, it's the one restricting in the reference. But then we switch to its side of the reference, and then it is restricted by the original reference. And it's a sort of perspectival move. But it's a perspectival move that has to happen. And it's not some kind of just mere appearance. It is a real distinction. A real distinction that quickly falls apart, but nonetheless it is a real distinction. So, and notice that the self-reference is restriction is the ought, and the ought of the ought is that which is restricted. One of the ways in which I could play this out is, insofar as the restriction is restricted, it is the ought. Insofar as the ought to be, in the very meaning of what the ought is, the ought is a negative being in the mode of a non-existent, or of a mode of nothing. Unlike restriction, which has this positive mode of being, the ought does not have that. The ought specifically has the accent of not being, but the ought to be. So insofar as the ought to be, and it can only ought to be, it is restricted because it cannot be. You get how that plays out?
It's just you really have to know the terms that Hegel's using to be completely comfortable with all the for the precise reasons as to how they work. But I tracked the general of the argument talking.
Yeah. I mean, there's a specific technicality to it, but it also maps very well with what we mean in just the regular terms in everyday life. We talk about, that which ought to be. If things ought to be, the ought to be is that which is not yet. So it's a mode of non-being. But if it only ought to be, then it's restricted. And that's what that which is restricted is that which is, not what it ought to be. So it's this is a weird shell game of negative self-references, which become more severe in certain other forms. Although the finite does have probably the most severe form early on in the book. I mean, this is why Hegel says it's like one of the most obstinate categories of the understanding. Most people just cannot get out of the contradictory way in which they think about finitude, because it is supposed to be by its own content a non-being, but we give it the form of being, and we grab hold of it. We remain in restriction. So let's continue. In order for the limit that is in every something to be a restriction, the something must at the same time transcend it in itself, must refer to it from within as to a non-existent. The existence of something lies quietly indifferent, as it were, alongside its limit, but the something transcends its limit only insofar as it is the sublatedness of the limit, the negative in itselfness over against it, and inasmuch as the limit is as restriction in the determination itself, the something thereby transcends itself. So in order for the limit that is in every something to be a restriction, the something must also at the same time transcend it in itself, must refer to it from within as to any non-existent. So insofar as the something has the limit within it, let me switch to Again, this is the something. Insofar as something has the limit within it, these areas are beyond that limit, and that beyond is the determination of the something, or the positive being of the something, whereas the limit is negatively referred to as its non-being. So, must refer to it from within as to a non-existence. So, the something as its determination refers to its limit as its non-being. The existence of something lies quietly indifferent, as it were, alongside its limit, but the something transcends its limit only insofar as it is the sublatedness of the limit, the negative of itself, over against it. So, insofar as the something, the determination, is the limit of the limit, it is properly transcending it. And inasmuch as the limit is as restriction in the determination itself, the something thereby transcends itself. Insofar as something is not just this, the determination, but rather is the totality, it transcends the limit because the limit is within it, constitutes it, and determines it. And so, if you want to, that's, if you're wondering, what does Hegel mean by transcendence? Well, here is the straight up conception you're going to be able to get. So, inasmuch as the limit is as restriction in the determination itself, the something thereby transcends it. It's transcending is a form of sublation. If you remember what happened with becoming and something and all that jazz, because the determination becomes the limit of the limit, or the something is the limit of the limit, and therefore it becomes a totality, transcends it. The ought therefore contains the double determination, once as a determination which has an in itselfness over against negation, and again as a non-being which as restriction is distinguished from the determination, but is at the same time itself a determination existing in itself. In order to limit something, if you remember the logic of the limit is itself an other to the something, but in being an other to the something, it is itself a something. So the limit ends up being the negative self-reference of something to something. Negative self-reference, it's negative mode. Well, literally just remember what negation is. It's the distinction, or the non-being of the unity. The non-being of the unity of something with itself is what limit is. Or rather, the difference with itself is what limit is. Various ways to put it. So the ought therefore contains the double determination, once as a determination which has an in itselfness over against negation. So the ought has the form of, so insofar as this is limit, this the red area would be the determination, or the ought, in relationship to the limit, which is the restriction. So yes, what it says, the ought therefore contains a double determination, once as a determination given which has an in itselfness over against negation. So insofar as the ought is the positive being in itself, which is the determination, and again as non-being, as restriction is distinguished from the determination, but is at the same time itself a determination existing in itself. So insofar as the limit itself is a something and an other, it is a determination too. So then the ought becomes the non-being of that determination. So it is not both the non-being of the non-being, but it's the non-being also of a being. So it has both a positive mode and a negative mode. The finite has thus determined itself as connecting determination and limit. In this connection, the determination is the ought, and the limit is the restriction. So, again, going back to this, purple is the limit, which in this totality is the restriction, and then the red is the ought, which in this totality of the finite is in the totality. The totality is a finite, and then these are moments of the finite. The finite has the moment of restriction in the ought. Restriction, the ought. That's another way to view it. Thus the two are both moments of the finite, and therefore both themselves finite, the ought as well as the restriction. But only restriction is posited as the finite. The ought is restricted only in itself, and therefore only for us. It is restricted by virtue of its reference to the limit already immanent within it, though this restriction in it is shrouded in itselfness. For according to its determinate being, that is, according to its determinateness, in contrast to restriction, it is posited as being in itself. So, restriction is also of mode of being for other, a higher mode of being for other, and the ought now is a higher mode of being in itself. So, as you can see here, you start using prior categories organized under the new category. You run them through the new category, and things start getting clearer in many ways, and increasingly more complex very, very quickly. You can do this, and when you do things properly, you will do this. But I think that that emphasis too early, or rather at any point, putting too much emphasis on that confuses things when you're just beginning. So, if the whole determination and the something and the limits, relationships here are too confusing for you, don't worry about it. Think about it in the way that I talked about earlier, which is, insofar as the restriction is restricted, clearly it's restricted by something else. What is it that restricts the restriction? Well, the meaning of that is the ought. What is it that the ought to be? And insofar as it ought to be, it is restricted. That's probably the simplest way you can grasp this movement. What ought to be is, and at the same time is not. If it were, it would not be what merely ought to be. The ought has therefore a restriction essentially. This restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is determination, now posited as it is in fact, namely as at the same time only a determinateness. The being in itself of the something, and here obviously only a determinateness. Well, what is a determinateness? It is a being with a non-being, which already then plays out the entire recurrence of the logic that we've done. A being with non-being is a quality, is a negation, is a something, is a limit, is another, is a finite. And the finite is now showing itself to be a mode of otherness. So insofar as it is determinateness, insofar as the ought is determinate, notice that, right? Insofar as the ought is determinate, this is, and then this is not, but its being and its non-being are unified. It exists just like existence. Existence is being with a non-being, or we could literally, that opposition maybe doesn't even work so well. We could also just see it as this, being is the white, non-being is the black. And then obviously then you can start seeing this, just the sheer development, that insofar as this is, it is not this. So it's determinate, but insofar as it is determinate, this is the reality, this is the negation, but insofar as this is reality, it negates this negation, and then insofar as this negates this negation, it is real. And insofar as those come together, this negative reference is what constitutes something and the other. And then we have this mutual being for other of, in which they are mutually others. And then we have this, insofar as this is, the other is also a something. Something refers to something, and it is really being in itself. Or rather, we could also just see it as, insofar as being for other is being for other, this, the other, and the something, this is something in itself, and then likewise this is all something in itself. Because if it wasn't, then it couldn't be for other in the first place. And then taking that into account, this then becomes determination, that insofar as it is not the other, it is in itself, that's what it is to be a determination. And insofar as, likewise, it is in itself insofar, or it is other insofar as it is in itself, that is constitution. This constitutes this, and this constitutes this, because if this white space wasn't here, the black space wouldn't appear as, a space at all, or anything determinate. It would just be an indeterminate, void, either way, whether it was white or black. So constitution and determinacy then mutually determine each other, and the determining word, literally, it just works so well, right? It is a being which is by not being. Being which has non-being is determinacy. And then, insofar as constitution and determination co-constitute and determine each other, we see that this link, this bounding difference, this limit is the way in which they are. If it wasn't for that bounding limit, neither the inside of the white nor the outside of the black would be. And then taking that into account then brings us to the account of the finite, in which the finite is this restriction and this ought. So, that's a simple way to consider that in an image. I mean, you could literally do this entire logic by just one line through the middle of this paper, through a blank paper, and boom, you have all the relationships that just spring out immediately. Makes sense so far? All right. So what ought to be is, and at the same time is not. If it were, it would not be what it merely ought to be. The ought has therefore restriction essentially. This restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is determination, not posited as it is in fact, namely as at the same time only determinateness. So, the ought doesn't have this infinite value we tend to place on it, in which it's just a pure positivity. No, it's already a determinate being, which means it has negativity internal to it. It has a difference. The being itself of the something is thus reduced in its determination to the ought, because the very thing that constitutes the something's in itselfness is in one and the same respect as non-being, or again, because in the in itselfness, in the negation of negation, the said being in itself is as one negation, what negates a unity with the other. And this other, as qualitatively other, is the limit by virtue of which the unity is as reference to it. The restriction of the finite is not anything external, but the finite's own determination is rather also its restriction, and this restriction is both itself and the ought. It is that which is common to both, or rather that in which the two are identical. So the finite is the totality in which, again, it unites and distinguishes both the restriction and the ought, and then it is a unity, a negative unity. Again, it's kind of weird that we have this idea, we have this kind of prejudice towards the ought as just being, weirdly in itself. At first I thought it was weird that Hegel talked about the ought in this way, because we tend to take the ought to be a moral category, right? You're like, what is the ought doing in a logical category and with ontology? But it makes sense insofar as when we talk about the ought, we're really talking about what is implicitly the in itselfness of things. We say things ought to be a certain way, and what we mean, if it wasn't for all these other restrictions, if the world if the world was what it ought to be, it would be so without all these other restrictions which are conditioning and causing the problems, that if things were left to just develop out of their in itselfness as to what they really were, then they would be what they ought to be. DM type things in the SOL chat, because that's where everybody else is like responding to. So DM says, being which has nothing conceptually is determinacy. I think it's an interesting phrase because it essentially explains how we tell difference in the world. Although I will remove the conceptually part, like just being which as much is not, or which has not non-being essential to it or imminent to it, is what determinacy is, and that is precisely what a distinction is, as I was showing in the black and white circle. And I think about that ought in a basic logical sense. I mean, we even have attempts with deontic logic. Like as I was saying, if it seems odd to you, I think it shouldn't seem so odd when we actually look at how we tend to use this in our everyday language. It's interesting. So continuing, but further, as aught the finite transcends its restriction, the same determinateness which is its negation is also sublated, and is thus it in itself. Its limit is also not its limit. Right, and one way to understand this is cheeky, as with all things Hegelian in a way. Just as the restriction of restriction is the ought of the ought is to be restricted. And the way he phrases it here is as ought something... but further, as ought the finite transcends its restriction, the same determinateness which is its negation is also sublated, and is thus it in itself. Its limit is also not its limit. Its limit is also not its limit, a self-reference. Let me do something real quick, DM, and then I'll answer your question. So, right, we have, yet again, restriction, which is restricted. That which restricts restriction is the ought. If we then take the ought ought to be. Why is it that it ought to be? Because it is restricted. If it already was what would be, it wouldn't be a non-being. But notice that the ought to be, in that it ought to be, it is restricted. So the ought to be restricted. Just as restriction, which is restricted, is the ought, you can literally think about this. Restriction ought to be restricted. That's why it's restriction. The ought, likewise, ought to be the ought, and precisely because it is the ought, it is restricted. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be the ought. And if restriction wasn't restricted, it wouldn't be restriction. And therefore we would not have finitude, and it wouldn't be an issue. But we rewrite back to something in limit, and we would still have those relationships imminent anyways. So it has to be worked out. So here what the whole point is that there is no issue between going from what, we normally think that the restriction is what is, and what ought is what should be if only the restriction was not. But in order to have the ought, we need to have the restriction. If there wasn't any restriction, there wouldn't be an ought. And if the restriction wasn't itself restricted, there would be no restriction nor an ought. Self-referential wordplay And I think in a way it is valid to call it wordplay. It's a, later on in logic at the very end, you get to the concepts of self-determination and freedom. And this is things which are done freely in a way are a kind of ontological play. So DM, what word could we use to describe being or existence in the most general sense? Being and existence. Those are the most general senses possible. Being is just indeterminate, unrelatedness, immediacy. Existence is like the most basic relationship, which is the relationship of being by not being. One might want to make a mistake. Oh, it's the relationship of being and nothing. No. It is one thing which has the dual face of being and nothing, which itself is just as much as it is not. So insofar as it is not. Insofar as it is not, it is. So being by not being and not being by being. That's what existence is. And that's just what all general, simple distinction of the most basic can possibly be made intelligible to be. But all right, is that clear so far? Are we confused? Are we following along? All right, hopefully it's clear. Anybody else got it clear? Makes sense? Following along generally? All right. Yeah. All right. Let's move on. The remarks should hopefully illuminate some things. I think they're more historical, but they're very interesting. So remark. The odd has of late played a major role in philosophy, especially in connection with morality, but also in metaphysics in general, as the final and absolute concept of the identity of the in itself, or of self-reference, and of determinateness, or the limit. And here he's referring to two things, Kant and Fichte. Kant leaves it, the ought is the most important thing for Kant morally, and for Fichte the ought is both a moral but also ends up being an ontological, metaphysical principle isn't the right way, goal. For Fichte, we can never make the world what it ought to be. The world can never be what it ought to be. All there is an infinite striving. So the ought is like a magnet pulling us along, but we will never get it, and it will always remain forever the ought.
It's basically a teleology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it in both senses, what we've discussed so far works to describe what the structure of its moral nature is, as well as its ontological nature. So Hegel says, quote, "You can because you ought," unquote. And, what is that? As far as I know, I think both Kant and Fichte says this. This expression, which is supposed to say a lot, is implied in the concept of the ought. For the ought is the transcendence of restriction. Restriction is sublated in it. The in itself of the ought is thus identical self-reference, and consequently the abstraction of being able. But conversely, you cannot, even though you ought, is just as correct. For the restriction as restriction is equally implied in the ought. The one formalism of possibility has in it a reality, a qualitative otherness that stands opposed to it, and the connection of each to the other is a contradiction, and thus a cannot, or rather an impossibility. So, I mean, this is obviously super interesting because Hegel's now giving us a straight up contradiction. He says, you can because you ought. This expression, which is supposed to say a lot, is implied in the concept of the ought. For the ought is the transcendence of restriction. Restriction is sublated in it. The in-itselfness of the ought is thus identical, self-reference. What is the self-reference? The ought is the restriction of restriction, self-reference, self-identity, self-sublation, and consequently the abstraction of being able. He's referring to something he writes much later in The Logic of Essence concerning actuality and possibility. And possibility is simply this abstract self-reference, immediate self-reference. Kant talks about something called, Kant is I think the first one to major put an emphasis on what is called logical possibility and other kinds of possibility. Where logical possibility is literally just the meaning of if a thing isn't logically self-contradictory, then at least it's logically possible. Whether it's empirically possible, physically possible, other issue, but at least it's logically possible. And here, that's why Hegel says, thus identical self-reference, consequently the abstraction of being able. So the ought is this logical possibility of pure positivity, in a way. But conversely, you cannot even though you ought is just as correct. For the restriction as restriction is equally implied in the ought. The one formalism of possibility has in it a reality, a qualitative otherness that stands opposed to it, and the connection of each to the other is a contradiction, and thus a cannot, or rather an impossibility. And that contradiction would always be just that if the ought really is what it ought to be, then it is restricted precisely because it is what it ought to be. Right? That's the contradiction, and that is the way in which the restriction arises in the ought, in which the ought cannot be precisely because it ought to be. So you cannot even though you ought. So we have two sides of what we would call by Kant's way of talking about things would be the antinomies. These are two contradictory conclusions which can be equally rationally argued for. They're both valid. And we have already gone through the movements in which this should, at least in Hegel's own way, it's shown to be valid. You can because you ought, insofar as it is the true in itself. It is the restriction of restriction. Therefore, pure positivity against negativity. But then, you cannot even though you ought, precisely because if it is restricted, it exists, it's qualitative, it's determinate, has an otherness next to it. Therefore, it is restricted itself. So, interesting paragraph, something to keep in mind. In the ought, the transcendence of finitude, infinity begins. The ought is that which in the subsequent development, in accordance with the set impossibility, will display itself as a progress to infinity. Regarding the form of restriction and of the ought, two prejudices deserve more detailed criticism. First, much is commonly made of the restrictions of thought, of reason, and so forth, and the claim is made that it is impossible to transcend such restrictions. What is lost of in this claim is that something is already transcended by the very fact of being determined as a restriction. For a determinateness, a limit, is determined as restriction only in opposition to its other in general, that is, in opposition to that which is without its restriction. The other of a restriction is precisely the beyond with respect to it. Stone, metal do not transcend a restriction for the simple reason that the restriction is not a restriction for them. However, with respect to such general propositions that are typical of the way the understanding thinks, as that it is impossible to transcend restriction, if thought will not apply itself to see what is implied in the concept, it can then be referred to actuality, where the propositions prove themselves to be completely unrealistic. Just because thought ought to be something higher than actuality, just because it ought to dwell in higher dimensions remote from it, and therefore be itself determined as an ought, it fails on the one hand to advance to the concept, and on the other hand it manages to be equally untrue, both in its relation to actuality and to the concept. Because a stone does not think, does not even feel, its determinateness is not a restriction for it. That is, it is not in it a negation for the sensation, the representation, the thought, and so on, which it does not have. But the stone too is as a something distinguished in its determination or its in itself and existence, and to this extent it too transcends its restriction. The concept which the stone is in itself contains the identity with its other. If it is a base receptive to acids, then it is oxidizable, neutralizable, and so on. In the process of oxidization, neutralization, and so on, its restriction to being only a base is sublated. The base transcends it. Similarly, the acid transcends its restriction to being an acid. And in the acid, just as in the caustic base, the imperative to transcend their restriction is so strong that it is only with violence that they can be kept fixed as acid and caustic base as waterless, that is, purely non-neutral. It's a really good paragraph, and I think it gives a lot of examples that are very intuitive. Seems pretty straightforward. Any questions on that?
Yeah.
All right. If, however, a concrete existence contains the concept not merely as abstract in itselfness, but as a totality existing for itself, as instincts, life, sensation, representation, and so forth, it itself then brings about by itself this transcendence and this transcending. The plant transcends the restriction of being a seed, similarly of being blossom, fruit, leaf. The seed becomes the developed plant, the blossom fades, and so forth. In the grip of hunger, thirst, and so forth, the sentient is the impulse to transcend this restriction, and it does transcend it. It feels pain, and to feel pain is the privilege of sentient nature. Pain is a negation within the sentient's self, and this negation is determined as a restriction in the sentient's feeling just because the sentient has a feeling of itself, and this self is the totality that transcends the determinateness of the negation. If the sentient did not transcend it, it would not feel it as a negation and would have no pain. But reason, thought, is not supposed to be able to transcend this restriction. Reason, which is the universal, which is for itself the beyond of particularity as such, that is, of all particularity, only is the transcendence of restriction. To be sure, not every transcendence beyond restriction is a true liberation from it, a true affirmation. Even the ought itself is this kind of imperfect transcending, and so abstraction in general. But the mention of a totally abstract universal is sufficient to counter the equally abstract pronouncement that restriction cannot be transcended, or again, the mention of the infinite in general is sufficient to counter the pronouncement that the finite cannot be transcended. So far the simple point is, only that which is a limit immanent to something is a restriction. If the limit does not appear within the something, it simply cannot appear as a restriction. The limit does not appear. Therefore, there is no ought. There is no sense for oughtness. He mentioned earlier rocks and dead things, and he says those things don't feel their lack of being alive, for example, the lack of motion, the lack of thinking, or these things. They don't feel that as some kind of restriction. Why? Because they don't have the limits which make those things appear within themselves. Insofar as the rocks have limits, their minerals are their limits, their restrictions. They overcome the restrictions. Why? Because they're the totality which subsumes their mineral being. Likewise here with the plant, in the hunger example. He says, these things have no problem becoming what they ought to be. And they do have a relationship of the restriction and the ought. The seed is restricted. It is not the plant that it ought to be. And yet precisely because within this living being, within the plant, there is the power which already is beyond this limitation, in which the limitation is. And the limitation isn't somewhere else outside the plant. It is within the plant. It is within the seed. The seed is this totality which already subsumes this limitation of just being a seed. Because it is beyond that limitation already, it has the capacity to move beyond it. It can go into its ought. The seed ought to become a full plant. It does so. Why? Because its total universal concrete being, its complete sublative being, is that in which the limitation is. But precisely because it is in it, it has this relationship of transcendence to it, and therefore it has no problem moving from the restriction of the restriction, the ought, and then likewise that back into the existent restriction again. And then for us, why is it that humans feel so unhappy in the world compared to everything else, which is a dumb animal or dumb rocks, which are just okay with their life? Animals don't stress out about the things we do. Why do we stress out about so much? Because we are a universal being. We have thought which has absolute sublative power, and therefore for it, anything that is negative is going to be a restriction for it. Full stop. Our bodies, despite being great, wonderful things that enable us to be free, nonetheless, there's many times in which we feel that our bodies are themselves an unfreedom, a restriction upon us. Why? Because cognition goes infinitely beyond that. Thoughts themselves feel as restrictions. We feel trapped within our minds. We feel trapped within our emotions. We feel trapped within, our little cognitive boxes of conceptualities. We're like, I wish I could see the world in a different way that would change, the way I perceive it. Why does it feel this way? Well, because thought, the idea, cognition as such, is an absolute universal which transcends all limitations. It is that in which all limitations exist as limitations, and what doesn't exist as limitation will not exist to thought. Thought itself exists in itself as its own limitation, but does not experience it as a limitation, precisely because then it recognizes its own limitation of the limitation, the restriction of restriction, and it is precisely then what it ought to be. So all problems inhere in thought, but all solutions inhere in it too. Anyone got any comments, thoughts on that? Nope, we'll keep going because we're almost done with that. We can recall in this context a seemingly ingenious notion of Leibniz, that if a magnet had consciousness, it would regard its pointing to the north as a determination of its will, a law of its freedom. Rather, if the magnet did have consciousness along with it a will into freedom, it would be a thinking being. Consequently, space would be for it a universal embracing all directions, and its one direction to the north, thus a restriction rather of its freedom, just as being held fixed to one place is a restriction for a human being, but not for a plant. The ought, for its part, is the transcending of restriction, but a transcending which is itself only finite. It therefore has its place in legitimacy in the field of finitude, where it holds in itself fixed over against what is restricted, declaring it to be the norm and the essential relative to what is null. Duty is an ought directed against a particular will, against self-seeking desire and arbitrary interest. It is the ought held up before a will capable of isolating itself from the truth because of its instability. Those who hold the ought of morality so high as to believe that, by recognizing it as the ultimate truth, morality itself would be destroyed. The brokers of reason whose understanding takes the unceasing satisfaction in being able to confront everything that there is with an ought and consequently a would-be superior knowledge, who therefore are all the more resistant to being robbed of the ought, these do not see that, as regards the finitude of their sphere, the ought receives full recognition. And of course, these would be people who love shitting on the world and love shitting on everything that you do, and then, whatever you do is never good enough. It's not perfect. It isn't what it ought to be. Of course, they cannot tell you how to get it to the ought to be, but they just know that it isn't what it ought to be, and they love to let you know that. I know some people like that. I think we all do. They're annoying. I think like in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel calls them beautiful souls. DM asks, I have a question. How can we imagine life's restriction visually? Well, the restrictions of life would be the determinations in it. So, the restrictions of a seed is one, that it is a seed, but immanent to the seed is already the universality of growth. So, it's subsumed. The life process of the seed itself subsumes the form of the seed as a moment. The plant has a restriction as merely being stalk and leaf. it overcomes that restriction in producing flowers and fruit, and then has restrictions and just being flower and fruit. Well, it overcomes that restriction in producing seeds and the reproduction of the plant itself. And in that, the plant or life overcomes the restriction of its finitude as individual, because now the individual can propagate individuality in other individuals and therefore become a universal life process. So let me see if I can choose green because it's plant life. So here we have the seed. The seed has the restriction of just being this, the seed. It must grow to the plant. So one would say that the form of the seed is the restriction, and then we have the ought of the plant, which has then flowers. Not a great flower, but also the ought. So this is the restriction, this is the ought, but there's also an ought in here. In the seed is the determination of the life process. You add a little bit of, you definitely add a soil. That is a further restriction, and then you also add water. And then this ought within the seed starts a process of subsumption of soil, subsumption of water, and then subsumption of the seed form itself, restricts the restriction, and then becomes what it ought to be. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's also a sense in which the seed is restricted by its individuality, but because it is restricted, it exists. To exist is to have this opposite besides oneself. Make this restricts this, but insofar as the red area restricts the seed, this coalesces into a different individuality in relationship to this. The restriction therefore restricts the restriction, the ought, and then we get this universal movement of the propagation of life indefinitely. All right. Where was I? Finitude of the sphere. Okay, the ought receives full recognition. But in the actual order of things, reason and law are not in such a sad state of affairs that they only ought to be. Only the abstraction of the in itself stays at this. Equally, the ought does not perpetuate itself, nor, which is the same, is finitude absolute. The philosophy of Kant and Fichte holds out the ought as the resolution of the contradictions of reason, though it is rather only a standpoint that remains fixed in finitude and therefore in contradiction. And here's something to note about contradiction. Contradiction is only a problem for finite understanding. It's not a problem for infinite reason. For infinite reason, contradictions aren't the death of a logical process. It has no problems. I mean, after all, self-reference, negative self-reference specifically. Restricted restriction. Somehow restriction is opposed to restriction. It is in not being itself, faced with itself, referencing itself, distinguishing itself from itself, which is a contradiction. This is A equals not A. Restriction is not restriction, which is a contradiction. And then the doubling of restriction, just like restricted restriction, is a negative self-reference. But it gets that to the ought, and the ought likewise has this issue. The ought of the ought is precisely that it ought to be restricted. But if we've done this quite a few times now. We've done it with becoming, we've done it with something, we've done it with determination, we did it with limit, we've done it with the finite now, and we're doing it again. And so, the issue of contradictions, I don't know, they're kind of bad. You should be already getting familiarized with this process and getting a sense that contradiction isn't this big deal for Hegel's concept of reason anyways. For the concept of reason of the understanding, it certainly is an issue, but Hegel has no problem dealing with contradictions. After all, the whole method thrives on it. So I think we're going to leave it here. We've been going almost for 2 hours, and we won't finish the infinite section within 20 minutes. So this is a good place to stop. I hope things were more than less clear. I did record this. I will upload it. So I'll finish the recording here. And for those of you who couldn't attend, hopefully you can attend later on. I do believe we will make it to the end of chapter 3, which is a really great milestone concerning this book.
I think the charts do a really good job at making this more clear. Or the little diagrams, they're great.
All right, thank you. That's what they're for. I try to make them useful. But anyways, I'll leave the recording there. See y'all later.